Thank you so much for turning out. When Jim and I discussed doing this talk some months ago, we sort of batted around what we would discuss, and we never really came up with the topic, so we just sort of came up with the place filler name, European Shipwrigging in the Age of Discovery, and I looked at that again on the website and thought, wow, does that sound boring? Oh my word. So I guess I wasn't the only one who felt that way. But I promise you, I will at least try to make it not as boring as it sounds. So let's look at this ship we all know and love, Virginia. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is the development of sails through history, and how they sort of lead to Virginia and Virginia's sail plan, and then sort of beyond that and where they go. Our beautiful little ship here, when I talk about the sail plan for Virginia, I always say that it's really kind of a smorgasbord of sails. It's just got this odd smattering of a little bit of everything. You've got the square spritsail, square topsail, the staysail, which is sort of a very standard-looking jib, fore and aft sail, sprit mainsail, lateen mizzen, just a little bit of everything. So I'd like to look at, each of these sails has its own path towards development. So I'd like to look at how some of these sails came about and how they end up on Virginia. But first, I'm going to take a step back and talk about sails more generally. And forgive me if this is sort of Sail 101. I know a lot of you are well beyond this, but just consider it like a refresher course, if you will. So there are really two main types of sails, the fore and aft sail and the square sail. Here's an example of fore and aft sails on our poor lamented Victory chimes, formerly out of Rockland, brought down to New York to become a restaurant, and just recently apparently decided, well, I could be a restaurant or I can sink here at the dock, and I'm going to sink here at the dock. So poor ship, as far as I know, is still at the bottom of the river somewhere in New York. But here she is in better times, and you can see she's a nice example of what we call a fore and aft sail. And a fore and aft sail is simply a sail that runs along the center line of the ship when it's set. So it runs fore and aft. And you can see they've got the three headsails and then the three gaff-headed sails on the mast. So fore and aft sails. Square sails, and here is the beautiful Mayflower 2, with a nice example of square sails. Some debate as to why square sails are called square sails. Some people will tell you it's because they're square, which, as you can see from the picture, they are in fact not square. Probably more reasonably, they're called square sails because they set square to the center line, as opposed to fore and aft. They are at a right angle to the center line. So you see here the kind of standard sail plan for a ship of Virginia's era, for a larger vessel, where you've got the spritsail, the foremast with the lower sail, which is called a course, and then the topsail, the mainmast, which has got the main course, the main topsail, and then the lateen on the mizzen, kind of standard. So those are the two basic types of sails: the square sail, fore and aft sail. Which one is better? Well, they both have their pros and cons. One of the advantages, now here's a sort of a diagram of a typical fore and aft, what we call a gaff-headed sail, because the head of the sail is held up by this spar called a gaff. This is sort of the typical rig on a sail like this. And one of the advantages of it is that it is very simple. There's just not a lot of gear on it. You've got two halyards. The halyard is any line that raises the sail. On a ship like this, on a rig like this, you've got a peak halyard that raises the outer end of the gaff, and a throat halyard that raises the inner end of the gaff. You've got a boom here, which holds the foot of the sail. You've got a topping lift, which holds the boom up when the sail isn't set. You've got vangs, which keep the end of that gaff from flopping around in the wind. And you've got a sheet that pulls the sail in or lets it out. So comparatively speaking, it's a very simple rig. There's not a lot of lines that go to it. If you get into a Marconi rig, which is sort of the next evolution of the fore and aft, where you get rid of the gaff and you've got a triangular head of the sail, which of course is what you see on most sailboats today. This is even simpler. Now you only have one halyard, you don't have vangs, so it's even simpler. Compare that to a square rig, a square sail. And the square sail is considerably more complicated. You've got, clewlines, you've got buntlines, you've got, in this case, it's called a reef tackle that pull the sail up. You've got sheets and tacks that pull the sail down. You've got braces that move the sail side to side. All in all, you've got at least 16 individual control lines for every one of these square sails. And then you multiply that by the number of square sails that you've got, particularly on these later vessels, and you see why you've got that sort of tangle of rigging that one associates with a square rig ship. Just this sort of crazy mass of ropes running everywhere. And because you folks were good enough to turn out tonight, I've got a special bonus slide for you, something that very few people have ever seen, and that is Virginia's main course, set and rigged. That is her lower sail on the mainmast. We went to considerable effort to build all the rigging for it, bent it on, hoisted it, set it a couple times at the dock, and then the Coast Guard said, nah, too much windage aloft, off it goes. So we have not seen that since. It's in a bag somewhere in here, and all the rigging is hanging up. But there you go. That is your special. That is your first special slide. So another issue, another comparison between the fore and aft and the square sails. You've probably all seen a diagram like this that sort of shows where a sailboat can sail. Obviously, a sailboat can't go straight into the wind. It's got to sail at an angle, or what we call close hauled. A fore and aft sail can sail considerably more close hauled than a square sail. So a fore and aft sail might be able to do what this boat's doing. A square sail, if it's lucky, can do what this boat is doing, but it's also going to be blowing downwind. So in reality, it's probably doing more like what this boat is doing. A square rig simply can't sail into the wind very well. A square rig ship is also very difficult to tack. And tacking, I doubt there's anyone here who doesn't know what that is, but I'm going to explain it anyway. Tacking, of course, is when a ship or a boat moves through the wind, it turns through the wind. So here you have a boat on a port tack, the wind is hitting it on its port side, and it's going to turn, it's going to go up through the wind and come around like this and be on a starboard tack. Now with a fore and aft rig, it's pretty simple. You just turn the boat, and the boat turns up through the wind, or the ship, and you sail away. You don't really have to adjust very much at all. A square rigger is considerably more difficult to tack. And here's a nice little diagram showing what it's like to do that. Here you have a square rig ship, really with a rig, a very sort of early 17th century style rig, sailing along close hauled, as close to the wind as it can get. As it starts to tack, it turns up into the wind, the sails start to flutter or luff, the ship turns up, and as the wind blows down the edge of the sails, they're all luffing and flogging like that. The first order is mainsail haul, and the sails on the mainmast and the mizzen get braced around, so they're going to catch the wind on the right side. But the foremast is left like this, so the sails come aback. The wind hits the sails on the wrong side, and you can see that actually pushes the bow over. And then once the bow comes through the wind, then the order is let go and haul, and the foreyards are hauled around and the ship is on the other tack. That is a very laborious, all hands on deck process, and there's a lot that can go wrong with it. Sometimes the ship will turn up into the wind and just stop and then fall back again. And we say the ship misses stays when it does that. Sometimes the ship will turn up into the wind and just stay pointed into the wind like a weather vane, and we call that being in irons. A lot of things can go wrong trying to tack a square rig ship. It's a very difficult thing to do. So with all this, you wonder, why would you use square rig at all? It seems like the fore and aft sails are much more advantageous. In some ways they are, but they also have a lot of disadvantages. And one of them is it's very difficult to scale them up. They don't have a lot of flexibility. Probably the ultimate expression of a square rig or of a fore and aft rig ship is the mighty Wyoming, built just down the road at Percy and Small Shipyard, which of course is now Maine Maritime Museum, largest, the superlatives vary, largest wooden sailing ship, largest wooden merchant ship, really, really big sailing ship, and all fore and aft rig. But you can see there's only so much you can do with these sails. You've got, 6 sails, they can be set, you can take them down in various ways, but there's not so much you can do. Here you can see that on the aftermost sail, the driver, I believe it's called, they've scandalized the peak, and I don't know if they're lowering that sail or if they're actually trying to spill some wind out of it, but there's just not a lot of options with a ship like this. Also, if you look at this great photo of Wyoming's deck, it's an impossibly long deck, it's just absurd, but you'll notice something here. That is the capstan for a steam windlass, what was called a donkey engine. They had these steam engines that were used to raise the sails. Like any merchant ship then and now, Wyoming sailed with as small a crew as they possibly could, and there weren't nearly enough men to raise those massive sails. So the only way they could get away with having a ship this big with that kind of rig was to have steam donkey engines that they could use to raise the sail. So without those, you couldn't have a fore and aft rig that big. Now, with a square rig, where you've got a lot of sails that are generally smaller, it gives you a lot more options. So if you look at like this diagram here of a ship shortening sail in heavy weather, and again, this is a ship about the period of Virginia. It's a much larger vessel, but you can see here is the ship under full sail. It's got the spritsail, topsail, course, topsail, to'gantsail, and the lateen, and also has a topsail in the mizzen here. Then as the wind comes up, now you've got a lot more options as far as what sails you can fly. Here, they're taking in the to'gantsails, and they're taking in the spritsail topsail. Now the wind's getting up even higher, they're taking in the topsails. On a later vessel, they would have left the topsails and taken in the courses, but at this time period, they're taking in the topsails. Now things are getting even hairier, so they've sent down the topgallant masts here. You see those masts? They're gone. And you can't do that with a big fore and aft rig. With a schooner, you don't have a mast that's built in segments like that because the sail has to be able to run the full length of the mast. So you need just one really, really long mast. So you don't have that option of starting to take the mast down as the weather gets worse. So now here you've got things are getting even hairier. In comes the forecourse, in comes the lateen mizzen, and then finally the topmasts are brought down and housed, we say, and that main course is lowered and most of it is tied up, so the ship is really prepared for heavy weather. Those are the kind of options that you have with a square rig ship that you just don't have with a fore and aft rig. And because you stuck with me so long, I've got another bonus slide here for you. Not even a slide, actually. This is, let's see if it's going to work. This is a video of the very first time that Virginia actually moved under sail power alone. It was all sail power. That mighty spritsail. Many of the folks in the audience are standing on the deck there. So there it is. Yeah, we were coming up the Kennebec River. The only sail we had was that spritsail, but the wind just happened to be perfect. Set the sail, put the engine in neutral, and we were actually sailing. First time. Okay, so moving right along. So the square rig ultimately is a more advantageous rig to use, but of course, one of the problems with it, as I said, you can't sail into the wind. So a square rig ship really has to keep the wind behind it, abaft the beam, as we'd say. And you get these kind of crazy sailing routes. So obviously here's the trade winds that brought Columbus and all the followers from Spain down to the Caribbean, that nice easterly wind that blows so steady. But to get back to Europe, you've got to go all the way up here and follow this northerly route, because again, you've got to follow the wind. You got to keep the wind behind you. A ship going from Europe around the Cape of Good Hope, around Africa, would actually sail with the easterlies across the Atlantic to about Brazil, and then look for those westerlies that they could pick up here and go around the Cape of Good Hope. So to get around Africa, you literally had to cross the Atlantic twice, just because you had to keep those winds astern of you. So this is why the square rig was, used primarily, but also why it had its issues. So let's look historically at how these sails developed. When did the sails first come to use? Who knows? So much of this stuff is completely lost in history. One of the problems with rigging, of course, until about 60 years ago, everything on a ship was organic and biodegradable, and it fell apart. But the wood at least lasted a lot longer than the rope and the sailcloth and that stuff. So you so rarely find rigging in archaeological sites. Occasionally you'll get a situation like with Vasa, where so much of that stuff was sunk in the mud in that anaerobic environment, and they brought up incredible examples of rigging and sailcloth. But for the most part, it goes away. So we don't get that kind of archaeological evidence for rigging. So we don't really know an awful lot about it. Some of the earliest depictions of ships under sail, this is a seal from a Minoan ship, this is a Minoan seal from about 2000 BC. And it's one of the very earliest depictions of a ship with a sail. So we know at least that far back they're using them. And of course, the Romans were using sails all over the known world at the time. The first sails that were in use were square sails, not fore and aft sails. And I'm not sure why that is, but it makes sense to me. I think the square sail is probably more intuitive than a fore and aft sail. Anybody who stood there and felt the wind hit them in the back and thought, wow, hey, okay, I can harness that. You think, okay, so the wind's pushing me. All right, so we're gonna get the fattest guy, and we're gonna put him in the boat, and he's got all that surface area, and that's just gonna blow you. You just see this happening. So they put the fattest guy, right in the middle of the boat, and the boat tips over because they figure out that putting the fattest guy standing in the boat is a really bad idea. But they think, okay, we've learned about center of gravity, that's good. And now maybe if we have something a little lighter, like maybe cloth, and do that, and then you see the sail developing. So I think even though the square sail uses more material and is more complicated, I think it's a more obvious sail. And I think that's probably why they were first developed. You don't see the lateen rig, the fore and aft sails, coming in until about the 2nd century in the Mediterranean. And it doesn't really become widespread until about the 5th century. And why they went to this. Again, it's not entirely clear. It probably wasn't performance-based, because a lateen rig like this is actually not going to perform much better than a square sail. This is not an America's Cup boat. So it's not clear. It's probably just because it uses less material and it's simpler to handle. It takes less people to handle it. That's most likely why the lateen rig ultimately supersedes the square rig, at least on smaller vessels like this. So then there's also the question of when sails first came into Europe. And again, it's not entirely clear. This is a neat little thing. This was found in Ireland. It's a first century gold model of a ship. And you can see, clearly you've got the oars, you've got the steering oar, you've got the thwarts for the rowers, and you've got a mast and a yard. And this is one of the earliest indications of the use of sails in Europe. It's not, there's not an awful lot of other evidence about that, and it doesn't seem like sails were in very common use at the time, but clearly they knew about them. Of course, the Romans had ships in Gaul and in England with sails, so they knew about that. It seems like that technology, like so much that the Romans brought, once they left, it just sort of disappeared, and everyone sort of forgot how it worked, and they had to reinvent all this stuff again, just like they did with roads and aqueducts and all that stuff. It looks like they did that with sails as well. Even the Vikings weren't using sails early on. It looks like the very first depictions that we have of sails in Scandinavia are like these Gotland, this is from Gotland, Sweden, these picture stones from the 8th century. And these are some of the earliest depictions. And again, there's not much evidence that they were using sails prior to this. Most of their trade was coastal. They could get around with oars. It's an interesting depiction here. You see this Viking longship. And a lot of what we know about Viking rig comes from things like this, and that's not much. It's kind of hard to decipher. You see this checkerboard pattern. Some historians have interpreted this to be ropes sewn into the sails for reinforcement and creating that kind of checkerboard pattern. And you can also see off the foot of the sail, there are these little lines coming down. And you see that depicted in a number of these picture stones, though it's not entirely clear what they were, if they were used to hold the sail down. These Viking era sails were actually made out of wool, which is kind of an odd material to make sails out of. But that would explain why you might need that reinforcement sewn into the sail, because the wool is not going to hold its shape terribly well. This is a replica of what's known as a Nar. It was a Viking era merchant vessel. I was trying to find the Snorri that Rob built, which looks very similar to this. I could not find a good picture of it, but anyway, this is similar. And most merchant vessels in this era, in the early medieval period, pretty much look like this, with one square sail, and it's essentially an open boat with a little bit of decking on it. And you don't see an awful lot of real development in ship and rig until the sort of early or the later medieval period, with the development of the cog, which was the first kind of real ocean-going vessel with a hold and a deck and a more sophisticated rig, and that really kind of changes everything. So we have here, this is a replica of the Santa Maria, and her hull is quite similar to what the cogs were. It's a little more sophisticated. But she really represents kind of, that later medieval period in shipbuilding. And you've got the spritsail here, 3 masts, square rigged on the first 2 masts, lateen rig on the mizzen. And you start to see this combination of square sails and fore and aft sails. And really, this rig is basically the standard rig that will be used for the entire age of sail. It gets expanded, it gets refined, it gets, more sails are added, but ultimately this is what it is. It's 4-mast, square rigged with some 4.5 sails. This is pretty much what ships would be for the rest of the time. So now let's look at our own beloved little Virginia. Here she is, the only known picture of Virginia. Of course, that's from the Hunt map. The only known picture of the ship drawn by someone that we know actually had never seen the ship, but probably, knew what it looked like since he was pretty involved in the whole northern colony. Here's a drawing that was done based on the Hunt map, and you can see very simple rig. You've got the staysail here, or you might call it a jib, and then the sprit main, which is sort of a 4.5 sail that's supported by this long sprit yard here. The sprit rig is something that was very popular in Holland, obviously in use in England too, and other places. This is a painting from 1673 by Wilhelm van de Velde the Younger, Dutch painter, and you can see that neat depiction of the sprit rig here. Have you ever noticed how all of these Dutch maritime paintings, they're all like these horrible storms and ships being wrecked on rocks and people screaming as they're being swept away? And these are awfully morbid people, the Dutch. Honestly, you'd think if you lived in Holland at the time, you'd never set foot on a ship. Every painting is like that. So anyway, here's, you see all sorts of great paintings of spritzels like that. So here's the sprit again on Virginia. The rig, as you've seen on the Hunt map, of course, our Virginia doesn't look like this. Our Virginia looks like this. Or even better, here's a photo of her. So why is that? Well, when our replica was being designed, as I said, the only depiction they had was the picture on the Hunt map. But it seemed clear to the folks that were designing it that that rig would not be very sufficient for a ship to cross the ocean. And that's probably true. Because again, like we were saying before, that kind of fore and aft rig doesn't leave you a lot of options, particularly a sprit rig like that. You can see it's up or it's down, or you can take the bottom off here, the bonnet, to shorten it, but there's not an awful lot you can do. So you don't have a lot of options. So they figured that when Virginia went back to England, they probably re-rigged it with a rig that was more appropriate for an ocean passage. So now you have got 6 different sails to select from and a lot of different options in terms of what sails you're going to set for whatever weather conditions you have. And of course, there are a number of contemporary paintings that depict a rig like this. And when they built the new replica of Maryland Dove down in Maryland, which is a ship of similar size and era as ours, and they did a great deal of research because they had very deep pockets, and they came up with basically the exact same rig that we had here. So that's very nice. So we see Virginia's rig, as I said at the outset, it's really kind of a smorgasbord of a bunch of different things. And it's a very kind of archaic rig. And a lot of it is not very efficient. This sprit rig is definitely a problem. And a lot of you folks here who have worked on the ship and sailed the ship know how problematic it can be, because you've got this enormous spar, very, very heavy spar, and all it's doing is holding up the corner of the sail. It seems kind of a little silly. I actually found out that on Maryland Dove, their sprit yard, they made it hollow because they're too chicken. They're too chicken to get out there with some big ass wooden spar swinging around, but we're not afraid.
Jim, they also are a few years later, and their sail plan, which I got because they use the same sail maker as we did, had an option for a gaff. And they told me that they expected eventually they would convert to a gaff.
Interesting. Okay. And there's that other ship. I can never remember the name, but it's the one. It operates in New York.
The Unroost.
Unroost, yes. And I think they started right with the spread, and it scared the hell out of them, so they went to a gaff. Yeah. So yeah, not the best. Most efficient design, and again, you can't scale it up. You can't get much bigger than we have, or it just gets very unwieldy. You know, it's a great rig for a smaller boat. You see the sprit rig a lot on small boats, but at a certain point, it starts getting a little crazy. Same with the Latine rig here. You know, and ours is not a terribly big spar, but it can start getting kind of unwieldy. It can be a pretty big spar. So you see the development, you can sort of see how this changes. You look at this ship from the Revolutionary War frigate Randolph, and you can see here the latine, what was latine, has been cut in two and laced to the mast. And now it's become a spanker. But because we don't like change in the maritime world, we don't change things quickly, for decades they kept the front part of that yard. Until finally someone said, you know, that's not really doing anything. Why don't we just cut that off? So ultimately they just cut it off. But so now you get this gaff, which is a considerably more reasonable spar. And because it's lighter, you can start making it bigger, and then ultimately, you know, again, here's Wyoming, the ultimate expression of this kind of gaff-headed rig with these gaffs, which are just massive. But again, you can, you know, they're better than less massive than a sprit rig, and with the donkey engine, they can be raised. So, to look at the sort of culmination of the rig's development, we see, you know, we've been looking at some of these 17th century vessels, Virginia in particular, with the kind of odd mishmash. By the late 18th century, you start to see this more refined development where you have more of a combination of fore and aft and square sails. So now you've got several head sails out here, still got the spritsail. Now you've got the course, topsail, to'gantsail, you've got staysails in between. So you're starting to see a more elaborate rig with more fore and aft and square sails. And then of course the ultimate expression of this here is the Peking, which is down the South Street Seaport for many years now, back in Germany. But here she's sort of the ultimate development in this, a four-masted bark where you've got the lower courses. They realize as these topsails get bigger and bigger, they realize, okay, this is just getting out of control. So we'll just split them in two. So you have a lower topsail and an upper topsail. And then you had a massive topgallant sail. And then finally they realized, you know, these topgallants are getting out of control too. We'll split these in two. So you get a lower topgallant, upper topgallant, and then royal. So here, really ultimately, the final development of the square rig. And many, many fore and aft sails. You can't see them in the picture, but between those masts, many fore and aft staysails. So as incredible, as impressive, and powerful a development as this ship is, it's still not nearly as cool as our ship. All right, thank you very much.